Azure AD is a cloud-based identity and access management service. A directory is a hierarchical structure that stores information about objects on the network. Azure AD is Microsoft's multi-tenant, cloud-based directory and identity management service. For IT admins, Azure AD provides an affordable, easy-to-use solution to give employees and business partners single sign-on access to thousands of cloud SaaS applications like Office 365, Salesforce, Dropbox, and Concur. Now let's examine the various types of users of Azure AD. Azure AD can be accessed by external as well as internal resources. Users can be IT admins, app developers, or Microsoft Cloud app subscribers, and Azure AD roles are used to manage Azure AD resources in a directory. Some important Azure AD roles are Global Administrator, User Administrator, and Billing Administrator. By default, the person who signs up for the Azure AD tenant becomes a Global Administrator. Azure roles control permissions to manage Azure resources, while Azure AD roles control permissions to manage Azure AD resources. By default, Azure roles and Azure AD roles do not span Azure and Azure AD. However, if a global administrator elevates their access by choosing the access management for Azure resources switched in the Azure portal, the global administrator will be granted the user access administrator role, an Azure role on all subscriptions for a particular tenant. Although several AD roles span Azure AD and Microsoft 365, such as the Global Administrator and User Administrator roles, by default, the Global Administrator role doesn't have access to Azure resources. Now that we have identified the main users of Azure AD, let's discuss the differences between Azure roles and Azure AD roles. Azure roles control permissions to manage Azure resources, while Azure AD roles control permissions to manage Azure AD resources. While both roles may manage access to Azure resources and support custom roles, there are two main differences between the two roles. The differences are the scope of Azure roles can be specified at multiple levels, such as the management group, subscription, resource group, and resource, while the scope of Azure AD roles is only at the tenant level. An Azure role has access to role information about Azure applications, such as Azure Portal, Azure CLI, Azure PowerShell, Azure Resource Manager templates, and REST API. While for an Azure AD role information can be accessed in Azure Admin Portal, Microsoft 365 Admin Center, Microsoft Graph, Azure AD PowerShell. A domain name is part of the identifier for many Azure Active Directory resources. Now let's talk about devices. We need to protect an organization's assets while allowing end users to be productive. IT staff will need to manage device identities to ensure that standards of security and compliance are met. To get a device in Azure AD, you have multiple options: Azure AD Registered, Azure AD Join, and Hybrid Azure AD Join. When we register devices, we provide users with support for the bring your own device or mobile device scenarios. Users can access the organization's Azure AD controlled resources using a personal device. Secure and further control these Azure AD registered devices using mobile device management tools like Microsoft Intune. Some scenarios that we could use for this is where we have devices that are registered not only with our full-time employers, but with contract or temporary staff. Azure joined devices are intended for organizations that want to be cloud first or cloud only. It enables access to both cloud and on-premises apps and resources. The scenarios for these are where we are using many different types of devices, including mobile and even devices that monitor our sensors and have IoT implementations. The other kind of joined devices are hybrid. These are devices that are joined to on-premises Active Directory and registered with Azure Active Directory as well. In these scenarios, we will have devices that are being used across both environments for development, for API integration,